Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. For the last episode in our series on social protection in conflict and protracted crisis, we're exploring social protection within the humanitarian, development, peace nexus. The triple nexus is about strengthening coherence, coordination and collaboration between humanitarian aid, development cooperation and peacebuilding efforts. The triple nexus has driven a stronger focus on how humanitarian cash assistance and national social protection systems can come together. But the role of social protection in fostering stability and promoting peace has been less well explored. With me to navigate the nexus, we have guests from the intersecting worlds of humanitarian assistance, social protection, and conflict and peace building. Rick Goodman is Director for Social Protection and Resilience at DAI Global UK. Lukasz Verboski is Team Leader of the Perihid Initiative's Technical Assistance Facility. The Perihid Initiative is a collaboration between the Government of Ukraine, humanitarian donors, UN agencies and NGOs to develop a resilient and inclusive social protection system in Ukraine. And Rachel Goldwyn, Senior Conflict Sensitivity and Peacebuilding Advisor at the World Food Programme. Welcome to all three of you. Rick, to start us off, how has the humanitarian development peace nexus, the triple nexus, driven thinking about the intersections and synergies between social protection and, I guess, especially shock responsive social protection and humanitarian assistance?
Thanks, Jo. In the 2000s or so, in Ethiopia, Kenya and across southern Africa as well, there was a convergence of various policy debates in international development circles and in discussion with host governments that countries were experiencing regular cyclical droughts and the need to have a humanitarian response that was commonly in-kind food aid distributed at quite vast expense. The timing and accuracy and effectiveness of food aid was not particularly well suited to the nature of the problem that it was designed to address. So there was a movement to encourage governments to take the lead on developmental social protection, providing social assistance to its citizens, but also to incorporate a mechanism whereby those systems could be expanded and used increasingly as a form of humanitarian response. Now, to a large degree, that's been very successful. Governments have, to varying degrees, taken on responsibility for financing the core social protection elements. It has indeed largely displaced in-kind food aid with cash assistance, which is, as I'm sure the listeners of this podcast will all be very familiar, has many advantages over commodity assistance. But what has not been so effective and strong is government's willingness to fund the shock-responsive elements of this, providing predefined levels of assistance to citizens in a predictable fashion. So that was the humanitarian development nexus applied to social assistance. But then you have the third aspect of the nexus, which we're going to talk about further in this conversation, peace and conflict. In these contexts, the ability to distribute resources in a way that is accepted as fair continues to be elusive. The donor drive is for upward accountability with its handmade and the targeting methodologies, results in a relative absence of accountability to the people aid agencies serve. And this results, or the potential for aid to be divisive at a community level, at a household level, between administrative units, depending on their political affiliation to the central authority. So there are many claims that social assistance transfers contribute to peace, but I think the evidence for this is scant at an intervention level. Aid agencies claiming that small and unpredictable monetary transfers, which is the essence of humanitarian aid, support social cohesion, and that if they are done in the name of a fragile government authority, somehow they strengthen the social contract. That's an extrapolation and wishful thinking. So I think the evidence is not yet established for how social assistance has indeed contributed to peace or reinforced the social contract.
Rachel, as Rick was saying, the intersections between social protection and peace are less well explored, certainly less evidence-based. Would you agree? And what do we know about how social protection can contribute to cohesion, stability and peace?
Sure, yes. And I do echo a lot of what Rick has said there. I'm going to focus mainly on the social contract because I think it's the really chunky one to have a conversation about. So if you kind of look at the belief, the theory, there's this sense that if a government is visibly delivering services that builds its performance-based legitimacy, and if you kind of bring in some mechanisms where people are able to hold the state to account, equitable, timely delivery of transfers. This is sort of the good stuff that people are hoping this social contract would result from it. And if we wanted to articulate that as a theory of change, you might say, if people experience repeat delivery of predictable support that's clearly attributable to the government, and if mechanisms for accountability and transparency exist and they are used, then people will increasingly trust the state. So if we look at the evidence base that's out there, about 10 years ago, there was a lot of effort around state building programming and quite a lot of research that was done to look at it too. And the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium back in 2017 did some very solid research around service delivery, around state building. And it was fairly clear that service delivery enhancing attitudes to the state, there really wasn't much evidence behind it. State reform's really political. It has to deal with vested interests, deal with corruption, things like that. And the programming was often very technical. If we were coming at this from a slightly different way and saying, okay, let's suppose you want to implement or use a social protection program as a vehicle to enhance state legitimacy, then what would that look like? And of course, we're coming back to peacebuilding. Let's look at a couple of common problems and think about how a social protection program could be relevant. So, for instance, a scenario where you have elites within the state who are diverting resources to their own constituencies, or you have a low level of buy-in to the social protection program. And so money that's supposed to be spent on social protection just keeps on getting allocated to the military. How would you then try to use social protection programming as a vehicle to try and enhance that situation? We could say social contract, but actually I would rather talk about accountability, equity, and responsiveness to the state here. So if we unpack that a little bit, on the vertical accountability side, we would want to have key players at the national level really listening and having to engage at the community level. And so there could be actions within a social protection program that could be building that connectivity, getting the elites to be listening to communities, having engagements that are strategically sequenced so that if people try to use bias and divert resources, they are confronted by the population that they then have to respond to. So there's kind of some actions one can take there. And then at the horizontal level, particularly to make sure that those budgets don't end up always with the military, you need to be supporting key players who can do advocacy across a range of different government roles, figures, so that that budget can be protected, and then having a pegged system. The World Bank itself uses milestones related to PFM in terms of how it engages with a state. Well, similarly, one can do that in terms of thinking about a social protection project.
It is really striking to hear you both talk about accountability and accountability mechanisms. I think we were talking about social protection systems and that kind of building blocks or delivery chain approach. There's a lot of investment up front on things like the targeting and the management information system and probably the payment systems. But I think we often do see that grievance part, at least mechanistically, addressed right at the end. And also, as you're saying, Rachel, accountability isn't just about being able to make a complaint. It's about the engagement all along the way and hearing from people from the design through to the delivery of these systems. Lukash, throughout this series, we've talked about how humanitarian action can work to maintain or sustain social protection systems in conflict and crisis setting. In the last episode, we looked at the case of Yemen, where a partnership between the Yemen Social Fund for Development and the World Bank and UNICEF has kept that main cash transfer, the state cash transfer program, going through a time where the state was less able to deliver it. Ukraine, perhaps by contrast, provides a really great example of how humanitarian assistance can be integrated with well-established state social protection systems, and indeed where Ukrainian authorities have played the lead and coordinating roles. Can you give us an overview of how Ukraine's own social protection systems responded in the early part of the war and how humanitarian assistance has been coordinated as part of that effort?
Thank you. In terms of the Ukraine social protection system, colleagues were just talking about the context where we don't have usually a comprehensive, complex and well-funded social protection system. And Ukraine is in that sense an outlier with a social protection system that is investing 15% of the GDP into social protection annually. And that continued with the invasion of 2022. Which is actually quite admirable because it simply continued paying the benefits for life cycle vulnerabilities, for pensions, for maternity, etc. And I think that's one element of the response. Like, it actually didn't disappear, it stayed there. And the realization that this constitutes still a substantial amount of the income of the population and it continues through the crisis. That was something that of course, also the humanitarians that would come in to respond learned over time. But that's the baseline. But then, of course, we had really the response to the shocks. And we saw Ukraine being quite quick, introducing or even fixing delivery systems. They were able to restore the pension payment system in 2 days after major cyber attack in the beginning of the war. We would see the government setting up an emergency cash assistance programs for victims of the flood when the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed by Russia. And it took them about 13 days. Then there were many other examples, of course, scaling the allowance for internally displaced in less than a month and then delivering about $1.6 billion in 2022, nearly $2 billion in 2023, and about $1 billion in 2024. These are impressive numbers. And I think it's worth mentioning, but also we have some examples of how this actually served as a scaling factor for the humanitarian response. Using the government systems early in the response, we saw the government developing the eDopomoga platform, which was pretty much a self-registration system for those affected by the war that's used to scale the humanitarian multipurpose cash assistance. And without it, of course, we wouldn't see such an effective and unprecedented scale of the humanitarian response. I think this is a little bit on how Ukraine responded.
So, Rick, coming back to you for another example and looking at Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program, the PSNP. It's a shock-responsive program designed to help mitigate the worst impacts of climate-induced or weather-induced shocks on the food security of people living in extreme poverty since 2005. But in some recent analysis that you were part of, you talk about how that's come under particular strain from internal conflict in recent years. What are the challenges that social protection system has faced in responding to this complex situation?
So everywhere is unique, but Ethiopia illuminates several dynamics that are evident in many contexts. It's worth noting that the government of Ethiopia, from the beginning, always viewed the PSNP as a temporary component as part of its wider national development plan, alongside facilitating migration from rural areas to jobs in export processing zones, and the promise of cheap hydropower driving Ethiopia development, etc., etc. It always viewed consumption transfers and public works and household asset building of PSNP as a temporary measure, a stepping stone towards national economic development. So it doesn't come as a great surprise later on in the story to find out that the government deprioritized PSNP and the payment system, given that there were a whole host of other priorities and contextual factors going on. So alongside the PSNP, something maybe less talked about is the humanitarian operation, a government program called Humanitarian Food Assistance, or HFA. And this has continued to run and operate in parallel to the PSNP, two parallel lines never quite meeting, despite great efforts to convergence and integration and finding common ground on systems and targeting. They, by and large, still continue to operate side by side, even down to local community level. Now, during 2000 to the present day, Ethiopia accepted more responsibility for the PSNP, greater control over targeting, over transfer values, the key instruments of programming. At the same time, we had COVID and associated economic contraction that was combined with aid resources needed channeling to the Syrian war and then the Ukraine war, which depleted donor resources for many countries, Ethiopia included. And a drought occurred 2021, 2022, which used all the government's available resources as well as donor resources. So the government made a decision to prioritize payments to existing recipients of the PSNP rather than initiate its shock responsive element. In addition to that, there was various conflicts initiated. Tigray was the major conflict, but there were others in the country. Now, the federal government obviously took issue with Tigray and blocked the provision of PSNP in that regional state. So all told, it's a great lesson in wishing for increased government ownership. But when tested, a host government is not always willing to follow humanitarian principles or act in the interests of all its citizens. It sets its own agenda and priorities according to its strategic interests.
Rachel, you're a peace and conflict specialist who has worked in a number of conflict and crisis situations. How should international actors look to ensure that social protection systems and programs are conflict sensitive during these rapidly evolving and protracted and often chronic crises?
Sure. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, conflict sensitivity is all about whatever we're doing. How do we make sure that that intervention doesn't inadvertently get caught up in the conflict context and make it worse, which is the really fundamental element of doing no harm. Worldwide, the biggest conflict sensitivity risk for any type of intervention by any agency is targeting, so not unique to social protection, but the exclusion or felt exclusion of any specific group, it often causes tensions. And if your targeting criteria happen to align with any existing social cleavages, a group that is particularly poor might actually have been deliberately excluded because of its identity, its tribe, or other kinds of social identifiers. As soon as you start targeting them on the basis of vulnerability, then people may interpret that differently. They may think it's based on identity. When you get to the individual level, what is the targeting criteria and who is applying it? Is it open to interpretation? Might people be meddling with it and trying to bias it towards their friends and family? How can it be most transparent and downwards accountable to really minimize that bias? There's also a lot to do with cash. Cash is often a part of social protection programming, particularly the shift. If you're going from another type of transfer to cash, how does that affect household decision making? And particularly, might a man be more assertive and controlling of cash, whereas perhaps if it was receipt of commodities, it might have been left within the woman's domain, for instance. It might be that cash could affect local reciprocity. You know, the cash program might have a time-bound period, but actually years later, people may not be able to borrow from somebody else within the community because of their receipt of a cash transfer program previously. Obviously, cash is more attractive to loot or tax by armed groups. And there are some real risks in certain contexts about people who are the providers of cash and being linked to the security sector. So then there are things that are conflict sensitivity that are much more specific, I think, to social protection. And we're getting into the systems architecture stuff here. So things like, what are you doing with the data? Where's it stored? Who has access to it? Who doesn't have the relevant ID documents to get into the system? They might be a livelihood group, or maybe it's the women, or maybe it's the returnees from people who had been overseas. Maybe it's people in the breakaway territories. There may be real reasons why they don't want to hold that ID. What about the actual transition timeline to a civilian government? You might be working towards what you think is going to be a transition, and actually it might be completely reversed by a coup or some other kind of reversal. And again, maybe the handover happens, it's established as a system, but then actually the government starts behaving as Rick was saying. Other political agendas come to the fore. Maybe there's an election campaign drive that determines who's getting targeted, or maybe even the MIS could be repurposed for an electoral role. So all these different things can happen.
I wanted to turn to the issue of displacement. Displacement is a key issue, of course, in conflict and protracted crisis. Lukasz, how has Ukraine provided social protection and coordinated assistance for people who've been displaced as part of the war?
The government provided extensive support for the displaced populations. The government IDP allowance was considered as the main source of household income by about 22% of the displaced households, which is quite a substantial number. But it wasn't the only instrument, of course, supporting, especially at the beginning of the response right after the invasion and in 2023. The budgets allocated to Ukraine were extremely generous. It was the largest humanitarian response ever, but it's a fact. And of course, the multi-purpose cash assistance, but also other elements, working in collective shelters by humanitarian actors, providing rental support for displaced people, and also looking at, of course, different ways how to engage them back in livelihoods activities and encouraging self-reliance. That was something programmed extensively, were the efforts to keep the people active in the labor market. And the government's efforts, they really focused on creating these so-called passive labor market policies, how to enable the labor force to access the opportunities, which was something very simple. For instance, there's a municipal nanny program by the government that would provide childcare opportunities. We also discovered that some relatively simple tweaks could actually make quite some impact. For instance, mothers would be afraid for their kids, and they wouldn't sometimes send them to institutions if the institutions didn't have an appropriate shelter that would protect them from the shelling and the drone and missile strikes. So there is a lot of context-specific considerations that we uncovered in our work. But there were also more. And in Ukraine, IDP response by the government, the speed was actually a very important factor. There is a significant gap between the displacement itself and when the people get assistance, which was about 2 months. And that created also a very clear niche for the humanitarian response, being very fast, filling this gap and delivering the assistance in a way that really complements the longer-term government support. And in terms of the coordination, of course, we would see a lot of first humanitarian system-led coordination. But as the funding was going down, consultations and the lead of the individual regions or oblasts in Ukraine, as they call them, the governors would be taking more lead and they would start to be shadowed by the OCHA staff. And I think that's also an initial part of something that should be planned for, the gradual transition and enhancing the nationally led response or national leadership in the humanitarian response.
Lukasz, I was interested to also understand whether there's still a large cohort of people who have been displaced into neighbouring countries and whether they're continuing to draw on their entitlements or some of that support from Ukraine, even if they've been residing now in Poland for some time or elsewhere. How has that worked?
It's a great question. In the humanitarian response, we often talk about deduplication. And then, of course, if we see people moving, let's say, from Ukraine to the EU and being protected under the Temporary Protection Act, then we would, of course, ask ourselves the same question. There were different measures taken. For instance, people that would get displaced but would cross the border for longer than a month. Then the government would consider this population as not anymore under the obligation of the government in terms of benefits for people that are internally displaced. There were, of course, discussions also in terms of which kind of benefits would actually be relevant. For instance, contributory benefits. We are contributing to the system to receive old age pension. Is that the kind of benefit that should be stopped in case you happen to move abroad? And then maybe that's the last point, and this goes back to conflict sensitivity. Under international humanitarian law, that there is a lot of obligations also by the parties to the war or conflict. So in occupied territories, we would see people obviously even using that as a coping strategy, being a bit pushed to actually take the Russian passports so that they can get social protection benefits from the Russian social protection system, but at the same time not having really enough, and then taking a risk, maybe keeping the Ukrainian documents so that they can access maybe with big difficulties the Ukrainian benefits. So there is also evidence of that. Of course, between the, let's say, EU and Ukraine systems, much higher likelihood that there is going to be some deduplication between the parties that are actually at war. Absolutely no chance to do this.
Rick, what are some other good examples of where humanitarian assistance and local social protection are being aligned to ensure equity between refugees or displaced persons and locals alike?
Well, there is no golden perfect country or case study. Refugees present a particular political challenge, and governments in host countries are commonly very reluctant to provide more than the bare minimum, even if that just means accepting presence in their own territory. There's the evident risk of the perception that refugees are absorbing scarce resources, leaving domestic needs unmet. There are perceptions and the reality of depletion of basic services, despite the fact that access to employment has the potential to generate value and taxes. that in turn pay for those basic services. There's also the potential for competition in the labour market, maybe in particular sectors of the labour market, and in inflation and in basic commodities. So these are all things that add to a threat of destabilizing the established social contract or governance settlement. So, for example, internally displaced populations in Somalia who are commonly from marginalized communities in the first place will not be met with a hospitable reception and resourcing at their point of arrival. So that said, some examples of a coherence between social protection provided to citizens and displaced and refugee populations, resulting largely, I think, in the collaboration between host governments and donors and aid agencies. Mauritania, which is relatively small and stable, benefited from an alignment of interests of various stakeholders, donor agencies, who managed to establish close, trusted relationships between themselves and with the government that allowed affordable financing and alignment of objectives, and the government was able to provide the leadership to follow through and provide access to refugee populations to benefits. And the other example I would like to mention was Lebanon, going back a few years, in response to the Syrian war, which led to Lebanon hosting approximately 1.5 million Syrian refugees, in addition to Palestinian refugees already in country. That started to precipitate many of the community tensions and political effects that I've described earlier, including inflation and labour market disruption. And the government, to its credit, recognised the principle of equitable but differentiated access to benefits. So it attempted to create a benefit system that felt similar, felt fair and equitable to different populations, but was differentiated according to their needs. For example, citizens are already established and have social capital, but refugees are in a much more disruptive state and need higher degree of shorter-term assistance.
Rachel, these are obviously really complex situations. It's barely the half of it, isn't it? But I guess a lot of competing imperatives for humanitarian and local actors. Where do we see humanitarian development and peacebuilding principles come into tension or even conflict with one another? And how can those tensions be reconciled?
I see these as being different types of interventions, being for different objectives for different people in different situations. And there are differences between the principles, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily in conflict because you're not trying to apply them all at the same time. You know, humanitarian principles really are the superpower for humanitarians. That is how you are able to negotiate your access. That's the strength that gives you the ability to have some safety in doing things in quite difficult, dangerous locations. But there are always going to be dilemmas and trade-offs and compromises. And where those trade-offs and dilemmas occur is where a lot of the conflict sensitivity risks happen. The whole concept of conflict sensitivity starts from a position that no aid is neutral in a conflict context, and thus one has to try to understand what the risks are, where you might get caught up in it, and then try and avoid those. And then peacebuilding is taking a completely different approach. You know, peacebuilding is all about change. It's about challenging the status quo. It's about inclusion of excluded groups. It's about ensuring that systems are just and accountable. It's about dealing with human rights violations. The principles of humanitarianism are completely different with the objectives of peacebuilding. I guess there was one other element though. Does conflict sensitivity maybe delay things? Conflict sensitivity does ask that we consider and that we take time to think about what are the consequences of what we do. How much time you have can vary. You know, if you're in a fast-moving emergency response that's just begun, you don't have a lot of time to do that thinking, but you can apply a little bit of thinking time. You know, if you're a few weeks later, you actually need to be doing a bit more in terms of gathering information and understanding that conflict context. And if you're a year in, you really need to have a good understanding of that conflict context. So kind of what is good enough analysis, what is good enough conflict analysis varies over time according to the context.
Social protection, and then here I'm speaking about things like pensions, labour market programs, can form part of political settlements that maintain peace after conflict. The region where I live, Timor-Leste, is an example where veterans and their families have received pensions in perpetuity as part of demobilisation and peacebuilding efforts following conflict. Ukraine, of course, is a really different context. But Lukasz, has there been any thought about what assistance might look like after the war ends or perhaps de-intensifies?
The way I understand the question is that, of course, the social protection system, it's a toolbox that has multiple tools and different tools for different purposes. In Ukraine, for instance, when talking about social protection benefits for veterans or for even military personnel, of course, this is an active part of the war. So these instruments are used, and they're used by Ukraine and they're used by Russia very much equally, to first attract the people to the military service and to compensate the families. But of course, it will be an interesting situation in case at some point the conflict actually de-escalates and we then see how these benefits continue and how they, in a way, compete with the other benefits that are in the market. In Ukraine, we did a complementarity analysis of these benefits compared with the social protection proper benefits that are designed to fight poverty, and whether they are, excluding each other or not, whether they are simply add-ons to the income base, whether they are even used in calculation of, for instance, means-tested programs. Can you be like a beneficiary of a poverty program while you're also having your veteran pension? And these are a very technical question, I'd say, but very relevant, because this is exactly what could later down the road create some sort of conflicts or actually have outcomes that are unintended. But there are also all these benefits that are related to simply appreciating the defenders, as Ukraine would name them, which makes sense. So it really does depend on how this fits in the bigger picture. What is the share of the veteran benefits to the total benefits of the social protection system that fights poverty? And if this is largely disproportional or if this is complementary, if the fit between the benefits actually makes sense.
Yeah, and there's so many intersections out there in terms of vulnerability down the track as well, of people who sustained injuries and disabilities, what that means for their families and all of those things. Lucas, we do talk about social protection in established systems as forming part of the citizen-state contract. It's a very old idea and one that we tend to assume, certainly in contexts that don't necessarily have conflict. Citizens contribute, they get something back from the state. That's how it works. In this context where, I guess, morale, divided loyalties, competing sort of claims on people's sovereignty and so on are in play in a war like this, if we put it through that lens, how do you see Ukraine's social protection systems and its continued ability to deliver for people in the way that you've been describing?
When you asked that question, the first thought that came to my mind was the realization of the state of the priorities. So social protection has been the second highest budget item in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. And that says something, of course, after defense. And it simply says that there is a very deep realization that taking care of the vulnerable and those in difficult life circumstances is a top priority for the state to function as it is intended, meaning looking at elements or aspects such as social stability, social cohesion. And they do see it in this way. So there is both an economic argument for this, for the state, that of course supporting those that are really vulnerable and they are affected by the war does not only alleviate the war-induced poverty, but it also increases supply in the economy. So all these arguments are actually present in the discussion. Just back to your question about the social contract, I find that it is actually part of the social protection thinking in this sense. Not only on the social assistance, but also services, broadly all the social protection benefits, especially the active and passive labor market. It is something that is basically like a synergy. And this is, of course, also subject of external pressure. So we would see the state trying to fend off, for instance, disinformation campaigns or fighting the propaganda. So it's like a living organism that has these instruments that are taking care of some baseline social stability and cohesion. And then it has the defenders, the intelligence services, counterintelligence services that would be actively doing public communication that would be diffusing the Russian propaganda. So in this sense, this is to me also part of the social contract. And it's defending what is actually the subject of the constitution of the country, and which is then expressed as the elected government that is trying to do that. So this is a short reflection on your question. I think we could talk for hours about it, but the link between social protection and this I found quite important to mention.
Rick, Rachel and Lukasz, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection podcast today.
Joe, it's been a great pleasure. I think we could go on for another few podcasts worth of this discussion, so I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate being here.
Joe, thank you for the invitation and for the discussions. It's been a pleasure.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Hassan Alatar Sati. Hassan is an independent researcher and consultant with an interest in conflict sensitivity and social protection. Welcome, Hassan.
Thank you.
You've brought in a great selection of materials on social protection in Sudan today, and a running theme for this three-part FCDO series that we've been working on has been maintaining social protection systems in conflict settings. And your first pick looks at the challenges of maintaining key cash transfer programs in Sudan.
Yes, this is the new paper by Gabriel Smith for STAR. It's an interesting paper because it sheds light on the operational challenge and operational risks associated with the period of political uncertainty and worsening conflicts from 2021 to 24 in Sudan. One major operational challenge the study highlighted was ensuring conflict sensitivity, and this is due to the fact that intercommunal tensions persist in many parts of Sudan. The report highlights the effort exerted by different social protection actors to ensure conflict-sensitive targeting of different identity groups by applying different strategies. For instance, UNICEF carefully considered the diverse identity backgrounds within different areas targeted by the Mother and Child Cash Transfer Plus program. The concern for UNICEF was that ongoing conflict may potentially spoil intercommunal relations. So the design of the project was revisited to ensure conflict-sensitive design based on proper analysis to local conflict dynamics on the ground. The challenge then will be to ensure that the design of post-conflict social protection programs is done through bottom-up approach, ensuring that programs are driven by the priorities of local communities as well as local authorities. This is going to be critical for enhancing the legitimacy of the international actors involved in supporting these programs.
In this episode, we've also talked about how to make social protection more conflict sensitive, and that's the subject of your next paper called Effective Social Protection in Conflict, Findings from Sudan. What are some of the examples of how conflict sensitivity has been introduced into social protection or thinking about social protection in Sudan?
Yes, indeed. This is a working paper that was written by Izzy Birch, Becky Carter, and me in 2024. We explored the conflict sensitivity of social protection in Sudan. In doing so, we took stock of what was happening to highlight lessons or practices that may have wider application, including for the rebuilding of the state social protection system. Overall, international actors focus on the do no harm approach, which is minimalist conflict sensitive approach, focusing mainly on ensuring that social protection interventions do not fuel conflict or put responders at risk. Of course, all of these actors operationalize conflict sensitivity in different ways. First, some organizations have been developing processes and capacities for conflict-sensitive approaches. Example is mainstreaming conflict-sensitive indicators into result frameworks and building the capacity of country offices on conflict sensitivity. Second, some others made efforts to ensure that social assistance programs are informed and accountable to affected people. For example, under the Mother and Child Cash Transfer Plus program, UNICEF made efforts to engage with community leaders and tribal chiefs to overcome any trust issues with the communities. Third, international organizations pivoted to focus on core emergency priorities. This adaptive programming strategy was by a rapid response mechanism that produced data from conflict-affected areas. Fourth, national and international actors acknowledge the necessity to work with local actors. This is perceived as a crucial step for operationalizing conflict sensitivity and for moving beyond do no harm towards promoting social cohesion through inclusive social protection programming.
The previous episode in this series was on localisation and locally led social protection in conflict. We featured Myanmar as a case study where self-organising grassroots groups are starting to provide local forms of social protection in the absence of the state and with limited humanitarian presence in that country. So I was also really interested to see your writing about informal social safety nets in Sudan and your blog towards a conflict-sensitive role for grassroots organisations in social protection in Sudan, which appeared on the Conflict Sensitivity Facility website, and that's your final selection to highlight today. Why is it so important to consider and strengthen local organisations and systems, especially in conflict settings?
Well, since the eruption of the current crisis, grassroots organizations such as youth initiatives, the emergency response rooms, and other local initiatives have been at the forefront of response, autonomously and largely independent of the mainstream aid system, deriving their sense of solidarity from the deeply rooted social norms of the Sudanese society. They have been providing relief services to those who were forcibly displaced from their homes, wounded, or lost their assets. The increasing recognition of the potential role of mutual aid groups in the ongoing crisis facilitated more cooperation between them and international social protection actors. This cooperation allowed mutual aid groups not only to tap into external funding opportunities, but we often see that such a cooperation contributed to enhanced capacity on the part of mutual aid groups. External donors may find it sensible to tighten and control their systems when considering intervening in a complex emergency like Sudan's. But we need exactly the opposite. The courage of the frontline grassroots organizations offer a great opportunity to flex the systems in order to reach more people.
Hassan, thank you again so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this series on social protection in conflict and protracted crisis. It was produced by socialprotection.org, organised by STAR Facility and Basic Research, in partnership with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, which has funded this series and provided invaluable support in shaping the episodes and connecting us to guests. You can find the whole series and all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website, or search for the Social Protection Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Back next month. See you then.